Hello and welcome to my first Kerbal Space Program video. In this video I'm going to be going over how I'm designing a rocket to get a 10-ton payload into orbit. Now before I start building the actual rocket, I'm first going to put together a 10-ton payload so that I'll be able to test the rocket. And my payload is just going to consist of some RCS tanks and some associated odds and ends. I might theoretically use the RCS tanks for something later after I park them in orbit, but probably not. I've heard that in Kerbal Space Program, the optimal velocity of a rocket to move upwards is equal to the rocket's terminal velocity. Now, that means that you're going to need enough thrust to both overcome gravity and keep it moving upwards at terminal velocity. That would be about 20 kilonewtons per ton. Now, you're also going to want some extra thrust so that the rocket will move and accelerate, because of course it's going into thinner and thinner air with a higher terminal velocity as it moves up. So what I'm planning to do is I'm going to build a rocket with about 20 kilonewtons per ton of thrust when the rocket's full of fuel, and then as the fuel runs down, that will lighten the rocket and allow it to accelerate upwards and hopefully keep pace roughly with the optimal velocity as it travels in towards orbit. I'm planning to use a skipper engine as the main engine for my rocket. The skipper engine is able to provide 650 kilonewtons of thrust. Now, according to my guideline, that will be enough to lift 32.5 tons. We've got a 10-ton payload, which brings us down to 22.5 tons. We also have 4 tons for the engine itself, which is 18.5 tons. The control pod is half a ton, so 18 tons, which happens to be exactly the mass of a gray fuel tank. And I'm just going to ignore the mass of the docking port, which is 0.2 tons, since this is a guideline that I'm using for my rocket design rather than any sort of ironclad rule. I'm going to use some liquid fuel boosters on my rocket. I'm going to use a aerospike engine. The aerospike engine has 175 kilonewtons of thrust. Now that's enough to lift 8 3/4 tons in my system. So that gives me 1.5 tons for the rocket, and I will use the FLT 800, 400, and 100 fuel tanks to make up the fuel storage for that booster, which together adds up to about 8 3/4 tons. Now, I know from trying to build rockets like this in the past that I'm going to need 6 boosters like this, so that's what I'm going to do. And the way I'm going to set them up, I'm going to use something called asparagus staging. Now, this is a method in Kerbal Space Program where you transfer fuel from one liquid fuel engine to another so that as your rocket burns its fuel, you dump the boosters, but your remaining engines will still have their full amount of fuel. This can significantly improve your efficiency, and it also will keep my rocket a lot closer to that 2G optimum thrust that I'm going for with my construction ideas. In asparagus staging, the boosters will come off of the rocket in pairs, with the first pair feeding fuel into the second pair, and the second pair feeding it into the third pair, and the third pair feeds it into the main tank with the primary engine. Now, the way I'm going to set this up, I would just build it with the 6 times symmetry option on, so I get all 6 boosters being the same in the same place and so forth. And then later on, once I've got that set up, I'm going to change it in the staging options so that the boosters will come off in pairs. And before that, of course, I set up the fuel lines between the boosters. Setting up the fuel lines, you have to turn off symmetry and do them each individually because it's different on different boosters. And once I'm done that, I'll be able to do a test launch and see if this thing actually works. For some finishing touches on the rocket, I've put on some fins for extra stability, and I'm also going to put on some launch clamps so that it does not fall apart while it's on the launch pad. I'm not sure how well those aerospikes would hold up the weight of the rocket. And let's get ready to launch. So I've got a pretty straightforward flight plan. This rocket by design is fairly simple to operate. You just need to stage when you run out of fuel in one of your engines. I want to get it up to an 80-kilometer orbit, circularize, and then deorbit the launch system so that I don't have a bunch of debris sitting around cluttering up my orbit. And so far it looks like it's working pretty well. Just staging here. And once I get up to about 10 kilometers, that's when you want to start doing your turn. It's more efficient to get into orbit if you turn your rocket a little bit before you're out of the atmosphere, because ideally for an orbit you want to be pointing parallel to the horizon. The main reason you don't do that sooner when taking off from Kerbal is that there's an atmosphere in the way and you want to get above some of that. And various people have been playing around with that and have found that somewhere around 10 kilometers is where you want to start turning. So I'm just going to begin that process now and check to make sure everything's still going all right. When you're turning, you sort of want to get yourself towards a 45-degree angle. And once you're at that 45-degree angle, you just keep thrusting until your apoapsis reaches the desired altitude. So I'll just watch that here and get it up to 80 kilometers. And once it's at 80 kilometers, I'm going to cut the engine and just drift until I'm a little closer to the top. And once I'm at the top, the idea is to thrust in the direction of the horizon. So line up my nav ball with the horizon, and then just thrust until my periapsis reaches 80 kilometers. Or at least that's what I would like to do. In practice, I sometimes am not paying quite enough attention to all of the numbers, as you'll see here in a minute, and I may thrust for a little too long and have some work to circularize my orbit. As you can tell from my saying that, I'm actually recording this as a voiceover rather than as live commentary. And that's basically just because the software I'm using is a little hard to do live commentary, and it's also yet one more thing to distract me while I'm flying. So I would probably make twice as many errors if I was trying to do live commentary. But based on the attempt here, getting my apoapsis up and then having to spend a bunch more fuel circularizing, I actually decided that I do need slightly more fuel for this rocket. I decided to add another set of FT 100 fuel tanks, or FLT 100 fuel tanks to the boosters. And yeah, so you can see I've got my apoapsis now up to 130 kilometers, so I do have enough fuel to reach orbit. But yeah, maneuvering fuel is needed when you're not a perfect pilot. So for future use, I will have that. I also decided I wanted to add a pair of radioisotope generators to the launch stage, just so the control module there isn't draining any power from whatever payload I happen to have, as the launch stage really should be self-sufficient. So here I'm just burning a little at apoapsis to bring up my periaps. When you're in orbit, you always want to be making changes to the opposite side of your orbit. It's the most efficient way of doing things. Wherever you burn, the opposite side is where the most effect is going to be. So I'm going to circularize this a little, get it up to about 80 kilometers. Then I'm going to use time acceleration to go around and bring down the apoapsis to about 80 kilometers. And with that, I will have finished getting into orbit, and all that will remain is deorbiting the payload and finding something to ramble on about for the extra minute that this will take. I guess I can talk about what I'm planning to do in my next video. I'm going to set up a very similar rocket. It's going to be for launching a larger payload, specifically 42 tons. And 42 tons, as you might guess, is how much is convenient to launch with a mainsail engine, the next size up from the skipper and the largest engine available. So that should be interesting, and with that I'm going to have a much more useful dummy payload. Instead of being a stack of RCS that I will probably ignore, it's going to be a stack of fuel tanks, which should hopefully be useful for refueling things. Always a popular thing to do in orbit, saves you having to send up one gargantuan ship in a single trip, which can be very challenging. Even with the 42-ton launch stage, I'm expecting it's going to take me more than one try to actually build the thing. Basically, with the larger masses, you can start finding that your rocket engines exert enough thrust to break the rocket. And this results in a great deal of crashing and burning, much as my launch stage is now going to do, since I did manage to get it deorbited and on a collision course with Kerbal. So, it seems this was a successful test, as I'm now in a roughly circular orbit with a 10-ton vehicle. So, I will see you all next time.